My name is Flo Razowsky. I've created a project that I call Up Against the Wall. It's a photo documentation project about the look of borders as they become physical and evolve. For me, the project started in 2002. I was living in occupied Palestine, and at the time, the Israeli government started to build a wall in the West Bank that is now close to 500 miles long and in most places 25 to 30 feet high, concrete structure, watchtowers, patrol roads. And so I was watching this structure develop. I was working with farmers who were losing their land in order for this structure to develop. And watching this happen, just for me, it felt so absurd that in this day and age, as we consider ourselves so civilized as the human race, that we were still employing these tactics to separate ourselves from others, to lock people out. And so I started doing research about similar situations in the world, situations where more powerful governments were building structures to displace people, separate people, lock people out. And I came to realize that it wasn't that unusual of an occurrence in the world. And so I started getting myself to these places and photographing the structures themselves. I had found in my research a lot of documentation of the people impacted by these structures, but I wasn't finding a lot of documentation of the structures themselves, of the physical structures. And I was finding even less documentation that would juxtapose the multiple structures next to each other, so we could talk about the globalized world and that we could really look at the world we are choosing to build. And so I started traveling and photographing these structures, and since then have been evolving this project. So this is the structure between Spain and Morocco. And when I do this work publicly, a lot of people are surprised to find out that there's actually a land border where Spain meets Morocco, because mainland Europe is separated from the African continent by the Strait of Gibraltar. But Spain has these two very small enclaves on the African continent that they have controlled since the 1400s. They maintain control of these two very, very small enclaves. And so migrants trying to get into Europe to find work can move up through the African continent without as much documentation as they would need to go directly to Europe. And so they can move up the continent. If they can set foot into one of these two Spanish enclaves, they can then apply for asylum in Spain and thus Europe. And because of that, and in order to stop that flow of migration, Spain and the European Union have developed an extremely militarized border to make it more difficult for people to get into this space. And so this structure currently is a triple layer fence. So it's a fence, space, a fence, space, a fence that has guard towers. It's patrol roads. In between these spaces are different forms of diversion. So even if the migrants are able to get over one fence, they fall into an area that is, as in this picture, full of razor-sharp rods. So you fall into this space, you get stuck in it, in amongst rods that will cut your skin. And then in other parts of this, there's automatic pepper spray gets triggered, that sort of thing. So even if somebody gets over one spot, they still get stuck in this very deadly space. There was also a period of time at this border when migrants were attempting to cross in such numbers that many of them were getting shot and killed. By whom is still undecided. Spain has said that they didn't do it, but in order to avoid similar occurrences in the future, Spain simply pays the Moroccans 40 million euros a year to police this structure. Because Spain is trying to maintain some sort of air of civility so they have less ability to just shoot and kill people on sight. The Moroccans are not trying to be part of the European Union, so they can get away with it more. And so similar to the southern US border and that migration, the policing of the border gets outsourced to whatever country is on the other side of it. So then migrants who are able to set foot into these enclaves then are supposedly allowed to apply for asylum. The migrants that make it then get put into detention camps while they wait for their papers to be processed. The migrants that I met when I were there were generally from Algeria, Bangladesh, or West African countries such as Côte d'Ivoire. What happened in their situations was they got picked up by Border Patrol, they applied for asylum, they get put in a detention camp. Many of the migrants that I met had been in the camp for years, some of them up to 4 years, just waiting for answers on their papers. And according to them, their comrades, the majority of them got deported as opposed to actually getting papers into the European Union. And so I think now people try to circumnavigate these enclaves, making the trek much more dangerous. We hear about people coming through the sea, boats capsizing, a lot of death, and people trying to reach Europe. For me, part of the reason it's important to do this work is to expose those of us who aren't forced up against these walls in the world, a look into the world that we're building. For me, I don't want to be a part of a world where this is what we create. I want to be a part of a world where we're building relationships and treating each other in human and compassionate ways. I think too that the majority of people who are trying to cross these structures are doing so in order to find livelihood to provide for their families. In Europe, the migration we're seeing right now is largely due to people fleeing violence in their home countries. Most of the people that I talk to, and I would assume the majority of people, don't want to be leaving their ancestral lands. They want to be able to stay and continue that continuity, but they're being forced out through economic pressures, stuff like NAFTA, through, again, violence, civil wars. And again, for me, I don't want to be a part of this world. And I try to think about my own personal history and put myself in the shoes of the people who are trying to cross these structures, people who are being forced to move around the world, whether they want to or not. And it's not because people are bad people, it's because people are trying to provide for their families. And those of us who are already in the places they're trying to get to then criminalize them for doing so.